A boy sacrificed his cardboard house to help a millionaire whose car was stuck in the mud. He promised to repay the boy, but a few days later, he left the boy crying and covered in blood. The rain had not let up in hours. It drummed against the windshield, an unrelenting rhythm that blurred the world outside into streaks of silver and shadow. The wipers struggled against the downpour, swiping back and forth with the mechanical insistence of something fighting a losing battle. Streetlights flickered against the weight of the storm, their glow dim and fleeting, swallowed by the black void of the outskirts. Johnny Butler gripped the wheel, his fingers tightening as fatigue settled deep in his bones. He had left the city later than expected, another long day of meetings and negotiations that drained him in ways even his wealth could not compensate for. The road stretched ahead, empty and winding, the kind of solitude he used to find comforting, but now felt eerily hollow. Then, without warning, the tires lost traction. The car lurched, skidding sideways before dipping forward into an unseen ditch. Johnny's heart slammed against his ribs as he braced for impact, but the car came to a stop, tilted awkwardly to one side. He exhaled sharply, frustration creeping in. The dashboard lights flickered in defiance, casting a dull glow over the leather interior. With a sigh, he shifted into reverse and pressed the gas. The tires spun uselessly, mud splattering against the undercarriage. Again, he tried. The engine whined, and the car remained stuck. He cursed under his breath, running a hand through his damp hair. This was not how the night was supposed to go. Then, movement. A figure lingered at the edge of the shadows, barely discernible in the dim rain-streaked light. Small, hunched, unmoving. Johnny felt the prickle of unease crawl up his spine. He knew better than to trust strangers at night, yet something about the stillness of the figure made him pause rather than reach for the door lock. The boy took a step forward. No older than 14, maybe younger. His clothes were threadbare, clinging to his thin frame, soaked through by the relentless rain. His dark hair hung in uneven tufts, as if cut with dull scissors, and his hands, small, skeletal, were shoved deep into his pockets as though he were trying to disappear into himself. Johnny rolled down the window halfway. "You need something." His voice came out firmer than intended, a reflex of a man who had spent too long in a world where softness was seen as a liability. The boy didn't answer. He only glanced at the sinking tires, then at Johnny, before shifting his gaze to the wet piece of cardboard in his hand. Johnny followed his line of sight, frowning. Before he could ask, the boy moved. With slow, deliberate steps, he approached the car, crouched low near the front wheel, and slid the cardboard beneath it. Then he stepped back and gave the smallest nod. "Try again." Johnny hesitated. There was something about the quietness of the act, no demand, no expectation, just an offering, that caught him off guard. He pressed the gas. The wheels found grip. The car jolted forward, groaning as it freed itself from the muddy trap. Johnny let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He pulled up to stable ground, then turned back toward the boy. The cardboard was ruined. The makeshift bed, the only thing standing between the boy and the cold, wet pavement, lay useless in the mud. Johnny stepped out into the rain. "Hey," he called, raising his voice over the storm. "You out here alone?" The boy gave no response, but his shoulders tensed, a reflexive wariness that told Johnny everything. "Where are you staying?" Johnny tried again. The boy flicked his gaze to the broken cardboard, then back to Johnny. He didn't speak, but the answer was clear. Johnny exhaled through his nose, glancing up at the sky. The rain wasn't stopping anytime soon. The wind had picked up, cutting through the night like a blade. The thought of leaving this kid out here, drenched, shivering, with nowhere to go, felt wrong. He wasn't sure why. He had walked past countless homeless faces before, donated to shelters, and signed checks that eased his conscience, but required no real involvement. But now, in this moment, faced with this particular boy who had given without asking, Johnny felt something shift. "Come with me," he said before he could second-guess it. The boy stiffened. His expression, what little could be seen of it beneath the wet strands of hair, was unreadable. Suspicion, hesitation, fear, all flickering across his features in the span of a breath. Johnny sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, I owe you one," he said, attempting a lighter tone. "At least let me buy you dinner." A pause. Then, slowly, the boy nodded. Johnny opened the passenger door. Martin, though Johnny did not yet know his name, slid in cautiously, his wet clothes making him seem even smaller against the vastness of the leather seat. The door shut with a soft thud. As Johnny pulled onto the road, the car filled with the sound of rain hammering against the windshield, the rhythmic swish of the wipers, and the quiet breathing of a boy who had, for the first time in too long, found shelter from the storm. Neither of them spoke. But something told Johnny that this night was just the beginning. The rain had followed them home. It tapped against the windows, a steady rhythm against the quiet of the car as Johnny pulled into the long driveway. The headlights carved a path up the slope, illuminating the grand silhouette of the house that stood against the night. Large, pristine, and utterly lifeless, Martin sat stiffly in the passenger seat, hands tucked into his sleeves, his small frame dwarfed by the leather seat. He had barely spoken since they left the outskirts, his gaze flickering between the road and his hands, as if trying to make sense of how he had ended up in the warmth of this car instead of under a leaking overpass. Johnny killed the engine. The house loomed in front of them, windows dark, except for a single dim light near the entrance. He hesitated before opening the door, realizing suddenly how absurd this must look. A well-dressed businessman bringing a soaked, shivering kid into a mansion. But there was no going back now. He stepped out first. The gravel crunched beneath his shoes, rain drizzling onto his shoulders as he moved toward the door. He glanced back. Martin hadn't moved. "You coming?" Johnny's voice was casual, as if he were asking about the weather, but there was something beneath it, something softer. Martin's fingers curled slightly around the car door handle. His eyes flicked up toward the house, his expression unreadable. Then, cautiously, he slid out. The porch light flickered as Johnny pushed the heavy door open. The warmth of the house met them instantly, swallowing the damp chill of the night. The foyer stretched high above them, the marble floor gleaming under dim lighting. The space was too quiet, too sterile, like a showpiece rather than a home. Martin stepped inside hesitantly, his wet sneakers squeaking against the polished floor. His eyes darted around, taking in the high ceilings, the wide staircase, and the cavernous silence that filled every corner. This place. His voice was barely above a whisper. Johnny set his keys down on the entry table. "What?" Martin shook his head, looking overwhelmed. "It's big." Johnny huffed a dry laugh. "Yeah, too big, and lonely." Silence stretched between them. The boy shifted his weight, glancing toward the door as if reconsidering his decision to step inside. Johnny noticed. "You hungry?" Martin hesitated, then nodded once. Johnny walked toward the kitchen, flipping on the lights. He opened the fridge, staring blankly at the rows of untouched bottles of water, leftover takeout containers from nights he barely remembered eating, and a few unidentifiable groceries that had long passed their prime. "Right," he muttered, shutting it. He pulled his phone from his pocket. "Takeout okay?" Martin shrugged. "Anything's fine." Johnny ordered the first thing on the menu, something warm and filling, then leaned against the counter. Martin stood awkwardly near the entrance of the kitchen, his posture tense, like he was afraid to touch anything. "You can sit, you know," Johnny said, gesturing to the stools by the island. Martin hesitated before climbing onto one. His hands rested in his lap, shoulders still hunched. After a while, the food arrived. Johnny handed Martin a plate, expecting him to eat immediately. but the boy just stared at it for a moment before picking up his fork, taking careful, small bites, as if rationing each one. Johnny watched in quiet realization. "You don't have to save it," he said. "There's more if you want." Martin didn't look up. "I know." But his pace didn't change. Johnny said nothing more. They ate in relative silence, the rain still whispering against the windows. Afterward, Johnny stood and stretched. "There's a guest room upstairs, clean sheets, decent bed." He nodded toward the hallway. "I'll show you." Martin's fingers tightened around his empty plate. He hesitated, then he shook his head. "I'll stay down here." Johnny frowned. "There's a couch at least. The floor's fine." Johnny studied him. The boy wasn't being stubborn. He just looked uncertain, as if sleeping in an actual bed was too unfamiliar, too far removed from the world he understood. Johnny exhaled and rubbed the back of his neck. "Suit yourself." Martin nodded, setting his plate in the sink. He grabbed a dry towel Johnny had left on the counter earlier and dropped onto the floor in the corner of the living room, making himself small. Johnny stood there for a moment, watching, feeling something tight and unfamiliar settle in his chest. Without another word, he turned and walked to his study. The door clicked shut behind him. The room was lined with bookshelves, a desk cluttered with papers and files he hadn't bothered sorting in weeks. He sat down heavily in the leather chair, staring at the dark window that reflected his own weary face. Why had he brought the kid here? Johnny didn't have an answer. He only knew that, for the first time in years, his house didn't feel quite as empty. The rain had softened to a quiet drizzle by dawn, its rhythmic patter against the glass blending with the faint hum of the city beyond. Johnny stirred, reluctant to leave the cocoon of sleep, but something felt different. The air in the house was no longer heavy with stillness. There was movement, a presence. He blinked against the soft morning light filtering through the half-drawn curtains of his study. His chair creaked as he straightened, rolling his shoulders. The desk in front of him was no longer the chaotic mess he had left it. The stacks of papers, financial reports, contracts, invoices, had been arranged into neat piles, each categorized with an almost meticulous precision. Pens that had been scattered across the surface now lay in a straight row beside a fresh notepad. Johnny frowned, rubbing his hand over his jaw. He hadn't done this. The house was too silent for its size, but there was a trace of warmth in the air now, a strange but welcome shift from the impersonal emptiness he had grown used to. The faint scent of something toasted lingered. Pushing himself up, he wandered into the hall, his bare feet making soft sounds against the polished floor. The house, despite its grandeur, felt unnervingly unfamiliar to him in this state. Not pristine, not untouched, but lived in. The kitchen light was on. Johnny hesitated in the doorway. A plate sat on the counter, toast slightly overcooked at the edges, and scrambled eggs, a little uneven but edible. A cup of black coffee, steam still curling from its surface, rested beside it. And yet, the kitchen was empty. His gaze flicked toward the front door, where a shadow stood still. Martin. The boy had his hand on the doorknob, his frame stiff, and his gaze focused on the world beyond the glass. He hadn't heard Johnny approach, or if he had, he made no acknowledgement of it. Johnny leaned against the doorway, crossing his arms. "You leaving?" Martin didn't jump, and didn't turn immediately. Instead, his fingers flexed slightly against the knob before he finally turned his head, meeting Johnny's eyes with a guarded expression. "I was just—" His voice was quiet, almost careful. It stopped raining. Johnny exhaled through his nose, stepping further into the room. He glanced at the plate on the counter, then back at Martin. "You made breakfast," he noted. Martin shifted his weight, his shoulders lifting in a barely there shrug. "Seem like you don't cook much." Johnny let out a short, dry chuckle. "That obvious?" The boy didn't respond, but there was something unreadable in his gaze, something restrained yet knowing. He didn't need to say it. This house, for all its size and elegance, was barely lived in. Johnny sighed, rubbing a hand over the back of his neck. "Look, kid." "Martin," the boy interrupted, not abruptly, not forcefully, just stating a fact. Johnny paused, taking that in. He nodded once. "Oh, I'm Johnny." "Okay, Mr. Martin." He gestured toward the window. "You really planning on going back out there? And left me eating breakfast alone, not giving me a chance to thank you for helping me sort through that pile of paperwork?" Martin glanced outside again. The streets were still wet, puddles forming in uneven patches along the pavement. The cold morning air seeped through the slight crack in the door. "I didn't think I should stay," he admitted. Johnny considered that, then turned back toward the counter, picking up the coffee. It was slightly bitter, a little too strong, but warm. He took a slow sip. "I didn't ask you to leave." Martin's brows pulled together slightly, a flicker of something uncertain passing over his features. He studied Johnny for a moment longer before finally letting go of the doorknob. His fingers curled into the sleeves of his worn-out hoodie, as if grounding himself. Johnny watched him, weighing his next words carefully. He wasn't the type to extend invitations. He wasn't the type to force them either. "It's still raining," he said instead, as casually as if he were stating the time. Martin glanced back at the window. Tiny droplets clung to the glass, mist forming in the corners, where warmth met the cold. He hesitated. Then slowly, he stepped away from the door. Johnny said nothing. He just picked up his plate and took a bite of the toast. A little dry, but decent. He tilted his head toward the counter. "You eat yet?" Martin shook his head. Johnny slid the extra plate toward him. No more words were exchanged. No expectations. No explanations. Just the quiet acceptance of an unspoken agreement. And for the first time in a long while, Johnny didn't eat breakfast alone. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the world outside damp and glistening under the hesitant morning light. The house, however, remained still, caught between the echoes of past solitude and the unfamiliar presence of something, someone, new. Johnny found himself adjusting to the idea of another person moving through his space, though he wasn't sure what to make of it yet. He leaned against the kitchen counter, arms crossed, watching Martin pick at his toast. The kid ate methodically, not like someone enjoying a meal, but like someone rationing it, like he wasn't sure when the next one would come. It made Johnny uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite place. "So, Martin," Johnny started, testing the name on his tongue. "You got a last name?" Martin glanced up, chewing slowly. He hesitated, then shook his head. "Not one that matters." Johnny raised an eyebrow, but didn't press. "Fair enough." A few minutes passed in quiet. The sound of a distant car passing by, the occasional drip of water sliding off the roof onto the patio outside. It was oddly peaceful, the kind of silence that didn't feel empty for once. Then, Martin's gaze flickered toward the stack of paperwork, still sitting on the counter. Contracts, invoices, and all the tedious things Johnny had been putting off for weeks. "You run a company?" Martin asked, not looking at Johnny directly, but keeping his voice neutral. "Yeah," Johnny said, picking up his coffee. "Construction?" Martin nodded slowly. "Figured." Johnny's brow furrowed. "How?" Martin tapped his finger lightly on the counter. "You've got project estimates mixed in with payroll statements. It looks like someone printed out a duplicate expense report, too. That, or you're paying the same supplier twice." Johnny blinked. He set down his coffee. "Come again?" Martin sighed, wiping his hands on a napkin before pulling one of the papers toward him. "Here," he said, sliding his finger across the printed text. "This vendor's invoice was submitted twice, different dates, same total. If no one caught it, you probably paid both." Johnny leaned in, following where Martin was pointing. Sure enough, it was an identical charge. It was something he should have caught, something his accountant should have flagged. How the hell did you notice that? Johnny asked, surprised. Martin shrugged. I used to help someone with this kind of stuff. Just numbers. Who? Martin hesitated. His fingers twitched against the paper before he let it go. My mum. It was the first real piece of information Martin had given about himself, and Johnny could tell by the way his shoulders tensed that he wouldn't give much more. Johnny studied him, then exhaled. Well, it looks like you just saved me a few $1,000s. Martin didn't react much to the comment. He just leaned back against the chair, looking mildly uncomfortable. You're good at this, Johnny continued, keeping his tone casual. I don't suppose you'd want to look through the rest. Martin narrowed his eyes. You're offering me a job? Johnny huffed a quiet laugh. I'm offering you something to do while you're here, unless you've got better plans. Martin didn't answer immediately. He glanced toward the window, at the grey sky stretching over the city. There was no urgency in his posture anymore, no restless need to leave. Instead, he reached for another paper, scanning the text with that same quiet focus. You're missing a deduction here, he murmured, almost to himself. Whoever did this didn't account for overhead costs. Johnny smirked, shaking his head as he grabbed his coffee. Guess that means you're staying, then? Martin didn't reply. He just kept reading. And Johnny didn't need him to say it. The afternoon light streamed through the tall windows of Johnny's study, casting long, golden streaks across the floor. A faint breeze stirred the papers on his desk, the weight of unfinished business pressing against his temples. His laptop screen glowed in front of him, a never-ending list of emails and reports demanding attention. Across the room, Martin sat curled in the armchair by the bookshelf, his small frame half hidden by the oversized chair. A book rested in his lap, one of Johnny's, pulled from the shelves without permission but with quiet curiosity. He was absorbed, barely moving, eyes scanning the pages with an attentiveness Johnny hadn't seen in a long time. The kid was smart, that much was clear. Johnny sighed, rubbing his temples before glancing at his watch. They had been like this for hours, him working, Martin reading. The silence was comfortable, something Johnny hadn't realized he could appreciate. Then, out of nowhere, Martin spoke. You ever buy your own groceries? Johnny blinked, caught off guard. He turned his chair slightly, glancing at Martin. What? Martin looked up from his book, his expression unreadable. Groceries. You ever go buy them yourself? Johnny scoffed, leaning back. Not in years. Martin nodded like he expected that answer. He set the book down, stretching his arms over his head. I bet you shop at those fancy stores, the ones that overcharge for pre-cut fruit and call it gourmet. Johnny raised an eyebrow. And where do you suggest I shop? The market. Martin said it simply, as if it were obvious. Cheaper, fresher, better quality. And you don't pay extra just because someone in a suit decided to label something organic. Johnny studied him, amused. And you know this how? Martin shrugged. When you've got to make $5 last a week, you figure it out. Something about the way he said it made Johnny pause. Not bitter, not resentful, just matter of fact. Like survival was a skill he had no choice but to learn. Johnny leaned forward, elbows resting on his desk. You think you could do better? Martin smirked, his first real expression of confidence. I know I can. Johnny tapped his fingers against the wood, considering. All right, he said, closing his laptop with a decisive snap. Show me. The marketplace was alive in a way that felt almost foreign to Johnny. The air smelled of fresh produce, warm bread, and the faint spice of something sizzling from a food stall nearby. The sound of haggling voices filled the air, vendors calling out their prices, customers weaving between stands with practiced ease. Johnny had forgotten what places like this felt like. Supermarkets were sterile, neatly arranged aisles, self-checkouts, quiet background music humming inoffensively. The market, on the other hand, was chaotic and unpredictable. Martin moved like he belonged there. He navigated through the stalls with familiarity, inspecting vegetables with the same scrutiny Johnny usually reserved for legal documents. He picked up a tomato, turning it in his hand before nodding approvingly. "These are good." Johnny watched, hands in his pockets. "You do this often?" Martin shrugged, placing the tomato back. "Used to." He moved to another stand, eyeing the vendor's display. "Some places try to sell the older stuff at the same price. You got to check." Johnny followed him, feeling vaguely like an outsider on his own errand. He was used to convenience, ordering things online, having assistants handle the details of life he didn't want to deal with. But here, in the middle of bustling voices and shifting crowds, he felt something oddly grounding about the simplicity of it all. Martin picked up a bundle of green onions, considering. "How much?" The vendor, an older woman with sharp eyes, barely glanced up. $2. Martin gave her a look. "That's too much." She finally looked up, lips pursed. "That's the price." Martin set the onions down. "Then I'll get them somewhere else." He started to turn. All right, she grumbled. $1.50. Martin smirked, giving Johnny a glance. Johnny raised an eyebrow. "You always negotiate like that?" Martin shrugged. "People expect you to just take the first price they throw at you. They respect it when you don't." Johnny exhaled, shaking his head. "You're something else, kid." They continued through the market, Martin picking out what they needed while Johnny watched, feeling more like a bystander than an active participant. He had never thought much about how food made its way into his house. It just appeared, stocked and ready. But watching Martin work, seeing how careful he was about every cent, every decision, made him realize how much he had taken for granted. Finally, with bags in hand, they made their way back toward the car. Johnny placed them in the trunk, glancing at Martin as the boy settled into the passenger seat. "You're good at this," Johnny admitted. Martin smirked. "Told you." Johnny started the engine, shaking his head. "Next time, I'll make dinner for you." Martin didn't argue. He just leaned back against the seat, a ghost of a smile still lingering on his lips. And for the first time in years, Johnny felt like he had done something right. The office was quiet, except for the rhythmic tapping of Johnny's fingers against the polished wood of his desk. His eyes flicked between his laptop screen and the half-finished contract in front of him, but his mind was elsewhere. "Mr. Butler?" He blinked, looking up. His secretary, Evelyn, stood by the door, a tablet in her hand. "You have the final project review at 3, she reminded him, "and the pre-bid strategy meeting for next week's contract." Johnny nodded absently, rubbing his temple. The bid, he had almost forgotten. It was one of the most important contracts of the year, a large-scale development project that would define the next phase of his company. The kind of deal man-like competitors would kill to win. "I'll be there," he muttered. Evelyn hesitated. "Are you all right, sir?" He exhaled, leaning back in his chair. The past few days had been different. Not bad, just different. Coming home to a house that wasn't empty, hearing another person moving through the space, even if it was just the faint sound of pages turning or the quiet clink of dishes in the sink. It wasn't something he was used to. And yet, he hadn't found himself dreading it. "I'm fine," he said, standing and grabbing his jacket. "I'm heading out early." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "Will you need me to reschedule anything?" Johnny shook his head. "Just make sure nothing burns down before I get back." With that, he walked out, leaving Evelyn watching him with mild suspicion. What time did this story come to you today? Leave your information in the comments section below. The house was dimly lit when Johnny stepped inside. The air carried a faint warmth, the kind that came from a space that had been lived in, not the sterile emptiness it had before. As he moved through the hallway, his gaze landed on the living room couch. Martin was there, curled up under a light blanket, his small frame still. His breathing was deep and even, lost in the kind of sleep that only came to those who had spent too long being restless. Johnny sighed. The kid had probably fallen asleep, waiting for him. Careful not to wake him, Johnny crouched down and, with slow precision, lifted him into his arms. Martin barely stirred, just mumbled something incoherent before settling against Johnny's chest. The boy was lighter than he should be. As Johnny carried him toward the guest room, his eyes caught something he hadn't noticed before. Martin's hoodie. Thin, stretched at the seams, worn down by time. His jeans weren't much better, frayed at the edges, the fabric rough and faded. Johnny frowned. He had seen homeless kids before, but he had never paid attention to the details. The way clothes, once new, became thinner and weaker with every passing season until they barely served their purpose. He laid Martin down on the bed, pulling the blanket over him before stepping back. Tomorrow, they'd fix that. Johnny wasn't the type to take mornings slow. His routine had always been the same. Wake up, coffee, work. No distractions, no deviations. But today was different. As he sat across from Martin at the kitchen table, watching the kid finish the last of his toast, he found himself making an entirely unexpected decision. "We're going out," Johnny said, sipping his coffee. Martin looked up, suspicious. "Where?" "To get you some proper clothes." Martin frowned, poking at the crust of his toast. "I'm fine." Johnny raised an eyebrow. "That hoodie is about 2 days away from falling apart." Martin scowled. "It still works." "Not the point." Johnny set down his mug. "Come on, it'll take an hour." Martin hesitated, looking toward the window, as if debating whether to argue. "You've got work," he pointed out. Johnny smirked. "You keeping track of my schedule now?" Martin shrugged. "You're always working." Johnny leaned back, exhaling through his nose. "Well, today I'm going in late." That caught Martin's attention. He narrowed his eyes. "Late?" Johnny shrugged. "First time in years. I think I've earned it." Martin looked skeptical, but when Johnny stood and grabbed his keys, he didn't protest. The mall. A different kind of world. Johnny didn't remember the last time he had stepped into a mall without a purpose. Usually, if he needed something, he ordered it, had it delivered, and went on with his life. Martin, on the other hand, walked through the space with a kind of quiet curiosity. He wasn't wide-eyed or amazed, just observant, his gaze flickering between the bright window displays and the people moving past them. At the clothing store, Martin stood stiffly near the entrance while Johnny browsed. "All right," Johnny said, grabbing a few shirts and holding them up. "These look fine." Martin wrinkled his nose. "I'm not wearing that." Johnny sighed. "What? You got a preference now?" Martin crossed his arms. "I just don't need anything fancy." Johnny rolled his eyes. "Fine. Pick whatever you want." Martin hesitated before eventually selecting the simplest options: a plain hoodie, a pair of jeans, and a few shirts. Johnny frowned at the small pile, but didn't comment. After the cashier bagged everything, Johnny handed one of the bags to Martin. "Happy?" Martin shrugged. "Could have been worse." Johnny smirked. "That's high praise coming from you." The cafe was quieter than the rest of the mall, tucked away near the end of a long hallway. They found a small table near the window, the morning light filtering through. Martin ate methodically, much like he did at home, careful, controlled. Johnny watched, wondering just how long the kid had gone without knowing when his next meal would come. Halfway through, Johnny stood abruptly. Martin looked up. "Where are you going?" Johnny didn't answer. He returned a few minutes later with 2 ice cream cones, setting one down in front of Martin. Martin stared at it. "What is this?" Johnny raised an eyebrow. "It's ice cream, kid. You ever had it?" Martin hesitated before taking the cone, inspecting it like it might disappear if he wasn't careful. Then, slowly, he took a bite. Johnny waited. Martin blinked, then frowned. "It's cold," Johnny snorted. That's the point. Martin licked the ice cream again, slower this time, his expression unreadable. You don't have to eat it, Johnny said, amused. Martin huffed. I didn't say that. Johnny smirked, but didn't press. For the first time since they met, the silence between them wasn't tense or cautious. It was just easy. By the time they returned home, Johnny knew he had to leave for work. You good? He asked as Martin dropped his bag near the couch. The boy gave a small nod, still finishing the last of his ice cream cone. Johnny grabbed his jacket, pausing at the door. You know, this whole taking a morning off thing isn't so bad. Martin rolled his eyes. Yeah, sure. Johnny smirked. Try not to burn the house down while I'm gone. As he stepped outside, heading toward his car, he realized something. For the first time in years, he didn't mind being late. The city streets were alive with movement, a steady current of cars and pedestrians flowing under the glow of streetlights. The air was cool, carrying the scent of pavement after rain, and the low murmur of conversations drifted through the evening. Johnny walked alongside Martin, their pace unhurried. It had been a long day, work, meetings, the never-ending grind of responsibility, but for once, Johnny didn't let himself be consumed by it. Martin had been quiet since dinner, but not in the guarded way Johnny had first come to know. It was different now, thoughtful, distant in a way that meant something was on his mind. Johnny caught it when they passed a large poster displayed outside a high-end concert hall. It was for an orchestral performance, the kind of event Johnny usually brushed past without a second thought. But Martin had slowed his steps, eyes lingering on the advertisement just a second too long before looking away, stuffing his hands into his hoodie pocket. Johnny didn't comment on it then, but later that night he pulled out his phone and made a call. Here. Martin blinked at the envelope Johnny slid across the table the next evening. He eyed it with suspicion before cautiously picking it up. What is it? Tickets. Johnny leaned back in his chair, taking a sip of his drink. Figured we'd go to that concert you were staring at yesterday. Martin froze, fingers tightening slightly around the envelope. I wasn't staring. Johnny smirked. You were. Martin hesitated, still not opening the envelope. You really want to go to something like that? Johnny shrugged. Not particularly, but I figured you might. Martin glanced at the tickets, then back at Johnny. There was something unreadable in his expression, like he didn't quite know how to process the offer. Okay, he said finally, voice quiet. Johnny nodded, satisfied. The concert hall was unlike anything Martin had ever stepped into. Golden chandeliers cast warm light across the grand foyer, their reflection dancing off the polished marble floors. The space was filled with people dressed in elegant attire, murmuring softly, laughter weaving through the crowd like distant music. Martin shifted uncomfortably, tugging at the sleeves of his new hoodie. He wasn't dressed poorly, but compared to the men in suits and the women in evening gowns, he felt entirely out of place. Johnny noticed. Relax, he murmured, guiding them toward their seats. They're just people. Martin exhaled through his nose, nodding, but Johnny could see the stiffness in his posture. They took their seats near the middle, the grand theatre stretching out before them. The stage was illuminated in soft amber light, musicians adjusting their instruments, murmuring to one another as the hall filled with anticipation. Martin was still tense, but his eyes held something different now. Curiosity. Then the first note rang through the space, rich and full, and Martin stilled completely. Johnny wasn't paying attention to the music. Not really. Instead, his mind drifted, scanning the crowd, the architecture, the subtle hum of conversations in between movements. It was a habit he hadn't quite shaken from years of being in business, always looking for details, for things that didn't fit. And something didn't fit. A sound, faint, almost imperceptible over the music. A slow, rhythmic creak. His eyes drifted upward. The chandelier above them swayed ever so slightly, the ornate crystal catching the light in uneven patterns. Johnny frowned. That wasn't normal. Beside him, Martin tensed. He saw it too. The music swelled, masking the growing tension between them. Johnny's instincts screamed at him to move, but before he could act, Martin was already in motion. It happened fast. Martin lunged, grabbing Johnny's arm with more strength than Johnny expected, yanking him sideways, and then a deafening crash. The chandelier shattered against the seats below, glass exploding in all directions. The audience screamed, chairs scraping against the floor as people scrambled away. Johnny hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the air from his lungs. For a second, everything was a blur. Light, movement, the ringing in his ears. Then he saw Martin. Blood. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Tiny shards of glass embedded in Martin's forearm, small cuts lining his skin. His breathing was shallow, but he was conscious, his wide eyes locked on Johnny. "You okay?" Martin asked, voice slightly shaky. Johnny stared at him. "You're the one bleeding, kid." Martin huffed, trying to push himself up, but Johnny stopped him with a firm hand on his shoulder. His heart was still hammering against his ribs, adrenaline buzzing through his veins. This wasn't an accident. Johnny knew it, and by the look in Martin's eyes, so did he. He clenched his jaw. Whoever did this had just made a mistake. A big one. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, casting a pale glow over the sterile white walls of the hospital room. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was steady, a quiet metronome filling the silence between breaths. Johnny sat in the stiff chair beside the bed, elbows resting on his knees, fingers interlaced. His eyes hadn't left Martin since they arrived, watching the slow rise and fall of the boy's chest as he slept. The kid had scared the hell out of him. Johnny had seen people get hurt before, accidents on job sites, bar fights when he was younger, even a few injuries of his own. But this was different. The moment he had seen Martin lying there, blood staining the floor, something in him had cracked open in a way he hadn't expected. Martin stirred. His fingers twitched against the blanket, his brow furrowing slightly before his eyes fluttered open. For a second, he just stared at the ceiling, disoriented. Then, his gaze drifted, landing on Johnny. "You're still here," Martin mumbled, voice hoarse. Johnny huffed, leaning back in his chair. "Yeah, well, I figured it'd be rude to leave you bleeding all over a hospital bed by yourself." Martin exhaled, a weak attempt at a laugh. His arm shifted slightly and he winced. The cuts weren't deep, but the glass had done enough damage to require stitches. Johnny's jaw tightened. "You feeling okay?" Martin nodded, but the motion was sluggish. "Could be worse." Silence stretched between them. Then, "You knew," Johnny said, his voice quiet but firm. "Really?" Martin's breath hitched. Johnny leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "That chandelier wasn't just old, was it?" Martin didn't answer. His hands clenched the hospital blanket, knuckles turning white. Johnny exhaled, running a hand over his face. "What happened, Martin? Can you tell me?" For the first time since they met, Martin wouldn't look at him. His gaze stayed locked on the blanket, his shoulders curled inward, as if trying to make himself smaller. "Martin," Johnny pressed, softer this time. The boy's breathing hitched, and then, without warning, his small frame trembled. His fingers curled tighter into the fabric, his body shaking as a choked sound escaped him. Johnny's chest tightened. The kid was crying, not the quiet, restrained kind. Not the kind he had probably done 100 times before, alone in some dark corner of the city where no one could see. This was different. This was breaking. Martin's voice cracked, and he squeezed his eyes shut. His breath came out in short, uneven gasps, his body tense with something too big to hold inside any longer. Johnny didn't speak. He didn't move. He just let Martin fall apart. And when the words finally came, they came in pieces. I didn't want to. Martin's voice was barely above a whisper. I didn't. I wasn't supposed to stay this long. Johnny stayed silent, waiting. Martin swallowed hard, still not looking up. Kenneth. Kenneth Ward. The name sent a chill down Johnny's spine. Martin took a shaky breath. He has my mom. She owed him money, a lot of it. And when she couldn't pay, he took her. His voice broke again, his fingers gripping the blanket so tight that his hands shook. He said if I did what he told me, he'd let her go. Johnny clenched his jaw. Kenneth Ward, a name he knew all too well, a man with too much power in the wrong places, someone who didn't believe in losing. Johnny had beaten him once, won a major contract that Kenneth had wanted. It was business, but to a man like Kenneth, it was personal. And now, Johnny realized, it had never been about the deal. It had been about ruining him. You were supposed to spy on me, Johnny said, his voice carefully even. Martin's breathing was unsteady. Yes. And the chandelier? Martin squeezed his eyes shut. Kenneth wanted to make sure you wouldn't be able to bid next week. If you were in the hospital, or worse, he wouldn't have any competition. He let out a hollow laugh, bitter and choked. But I couldn't let it happen. I couldn't. You treat me too well. His voice cracked again, and Johnny exhaled slowly, his mind piecing it all together. Kenneth had used a kid, a scared, desperate kid who had no choice but to obey. Johnny clenched his fists, rage simmering beneath his skin. But when he looked at Martin, when he saw the way the boy had folded in on himself, waiting for anger, for blame, for something worse, Johnny couldn't bring himself to lash out, because he understood, because he saw it for what it was. Martin wasn't a traitor. He was just a kid trying to save his mother. Johnny let out a slow breath, forcing his voice to be steady. Do you miss your mom? The moment the words left his lips, Martin broke completely. A sob tore from his throat, raw and painful, his body shaking as he buried his face in his hands. Johnny didn't try to stop him. He just sat there, listening to the sounds of a boy who had spent too long holding everything in. And in that moment, Johnny made a silent promise. He wasn't going to let Kenneth win. The drive to Kenneth Ward's office was silent. The city moved around Johnny as it always did. People crossing streets, neon lights flickering in alleyways, the distant hum of traffic. But he barely registered any of it. His focus was singular. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his mind replaying Martin's words over and over. He has my mom. Kenneth had crossed a line. Johnny wasn't naive. He knew how the business world worked, deals, power plays, sabotage. But using a kid, holding a woman hostage, that was the lowest kind of cruelty, and Johnny wasn't the kind of man to let it go unanswered. The elevator ride up to Kenneth's office was slow. Too slow. The numbers blinked past one by one, a rhythmic taunt. Johnny tapped his fingers against the briefcase in his hand, forcing his expression to remain neutral. When the doors slid open, the receptionist barely had time to react before Johnny strode past her. Sir, you need an appointment. Tell Kenneth I'm here. His tone left no room for argument. Kenneth's office was at the end of the hall, sleek glass doors framing a skyline view. Johnny stepped inside without knocking. Kenneth was leaning against his desk, a tumbler of whiskey in hand, as if he'd been expecting him. A slow smile spread across his face. Well, well, Johnny Butler, to what do I owe the pleasure? Johnny didn't bother with pleasantries. He placed the briefcase on the desk and flicked it open. Inside, neat stacks of cash lay bundled together, more than enough to cover Amanda's debt. I'm here to settle what she owes, Johnny said evenly. You let her go, and this ends here. Kenneth exhaled a quiet chuckle, swirling the whiskey in his glass. You always did know how to make an entrance. He gestured toward the money. And here I thought you'd come to threaten me. Johnny's jaw tightened. Take the money, Kenneth. Kenneth glanced down at the briefcase, amusement flickering in his sharp, calculating eyes. "You know, I was wondering how long it would take you to find out. The kid did well, didn't he?" Johnny clenched his fists, barely restraining himself. "That kid is 14. Kenneth shrugged. "Old enough to understand the rules of the game. He had a choice." Johnny took a step forward, voice dangerously low. "He had no choice." Kenneth smirked, setting his drink down. "And what if I say no?" Johnny didn't blink. "Then we do this another way." Kenneth studied him for a moment, as if weighing his options. Then he exhaled, shaking his head. "You're still the same, Johnny. Always so damn righteous." He flicked his fingers toward the briefcase. "Fine. Consider it a done deal." Johnny didn't move. "I want to see her." Kenneth smirked. "Of course you do." He pressed a button on his desk phone. A moment later, the side door opened, and Amanda stepped into the room. She was thinner than Johnny expected. Her face paled from weeks of stress. But she was alive. Martin's mother. Her wide, frantic eyes met Johnny's, then she darted toward Kenneth. She didn't speak, didn't move. Johnny turned back to Kenneth. "She leaves with me. Now." Kenneth gestured lazily. "Be my guest." Amanda hesitated for only a second before stepping toward Johnny. He could see the exhaustion in her movements, the quiet fear lingering beneath her eyes. Johnny placed a hand on her shoulder, steadying her. "Let's go." Kenneth's voice followed them as they reached the door. "You can't save them all, Johnny." Johnny didn't look back. He just tightened his grip on Amanda's shoulder and walked her out. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and faintly burnt coffee, the overhead lights casting a sterile glow over the quiet hallways. Johnny walked beside Amanda, her steps hurried but unsteady. She barely seemed to register the world around her. Her focus was entirely on what lay beyond the door at the end of the hall. Johnny had seen desperation before, in boardrooms, in negotiations. But this was different. This was a mother, clawing her way back to her son. When they reached the door, Amanda hesitated for the briefest moment, her breath shallow, as if afraid the moment would vanish the second she touched it. Then she pushed it open. Martin was sitting upright in the hospital bed, his arm wrapped in fresh bandages, his face pale from blood loss but alert. The moment his eyes landed on Amanda, his breath hitched. For a second, neither of them moved. Then Amanda let out a strangled sob and rushed forward, dropping to her knees by the bed, her hands trembling as they cupped Martin's face. "Oh, my baby," she choked, her fingers brushing over his cheeks, his hair, as if checking to make sure he was real. "Oh, my sweet boy." Martin was frozen, his throat bobbing as he tried to speak, but no words came. Then, without warning, he threw his arms around her. Amanda's body shook as she clung to him, sobbing into his shoulder, her hands grasping at the fabric of his hospital gown like she was afraid he'd disappear if she let go. "I'm sorry," Martin whispered, his voice barely audible against her hair. "Mum, I'm so sorry." Amanda pulled back just enough to cup his face again, her thumbs brushing away tears. "No, sweetheart. Number you did nothing wrong." She kissed his forehead, his cheeks, her own tears streaming freely. "You did what you had to. I love you. I love you so much." Johnny stepped back, giving them space, his chest tightening at the rawness of the moment. He had never had something like this, not as a child, not as an adult. But watching it, seeing Martin, the tough, guarded kid he had come to know, completely fall apart in his mother's arms, Johnny felt something settle inside him. Martin wasn't alone anymore. An offer from Amanda. Minutes passed before Amanda finally composed herself. She wiped her eyes, taking a shaky breath before looking over at Johnny. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Johnny shrugged. "You don't have to." Amanda shook her head, standing slowly. "No, you don't understand. You saved my son. You saved me. She swallowed hard, then squared her shoulders. "Let me work for you." Johnny frowned. "Amanda, please," she said, her voice firm. "I don't have money, but I can clean, cook, do whatever you need. Just—" She glanced back at Martin. "Just let me be there for him." Martin looked up, his eyes still red-rimmed. "Mom, you don't have to—" Amanda silenced him with a gentle hand on his shoulder. Johnny exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. He didn't need a housekeeper. He didn't need repayment. But he saw the determination in Amanda's eyes, the need to do something, to contribute, to prove to herself that she wasn't just taking. And more than that, he saw the quiet hope in Martin's expression. He wanted her there. Johnny sighed, then gave a small nod. "All right." Amanda's shoulders sagged in relief. "Thank you," she whispered. Johnny waved her off. "Just don't expect me to start eating gourmet meals or anything." Martin huffed a quiet laugh, the first real one in days. For the first time in a long time, Johnny's house wasn't going to be empty, and for some reason, that didn't bother him at all. The house had changed. Johnny felt it in the small things, the quiet hum of a home that was no longer just his own. It wasn't just Amanda cleaning the kitchen in the mornings, humming under her breath, or the scent of real food cooking instead of stale takeout. It wasn't just Martin's presence, the way the kid left books on the coffee table, shoes by the door, or the way he no longer hesitated before taking something from the fridge. No, it was something else. It was the way the house no longer felt empty. It had been slow. Martin was still careful, still hesitant in a way Johnny didn't fully understand. He still folded his blankets neatly on the couch every morning, even though Johnny had told him, multiple times, that he had his own bed. He still asked before touching anything that wasn't his, even though Johnny had already given him free rein of the place. But there were differences too, like how Martin started making coffee in the mornings, not just for himself, but for Johnny. Or how, when Johnny came home late from work one night, he found Martin asleep in the study, curled up in the armchair, a book resting open on his chest. The lamp beside him cast a soft glow over his face, his expression relaxed in a way Johnny hadn't seen before. Johnny stood there for a moment, just watching. Then, without a word, he grabbed a blanket from the couch and draped it over the kid before heading to bed. "You're holding the pen wrong." Martin shot him a flat look. "It's a pen, not a jackhammer." Johnny smirked, leaning against the desk. "Yeah, but if you keep gripping it like that, your hand's going to cramp in 10 minutes. Martin grumbled under his breath, but adjusted his grip anyway. It had started accidentally. One day, Johnny had caught Martin going through some old financial reports, his brows furrowed as he scanned the numbers. "You understand that?" Johnny had asked, more curious than anything. Martin had shrugged. "Some of it." And just like that, Johnny found himself teaching. At first it was just the basics, how to break down a budget, how to spot an error in a ledger. But Martin picked it up too quickly for it to stop there, so Johnny handed him books. Some were business-related, some were literature, and some were just things Johnny had lying around. To his surprise, Martin read them all. And even more surprisingly, he asked questions. Not just about numbers or contracts, but about the world, about things Johnny had never bothered to stop and think about. And Johnny, despite himself, answered. Johnny had taken people to expensive restaurants, to high-rise meetings, to exclusive clubs. But a park, that was new. Martin sat beside him on the worn wooden bench, his hands tucked into the pockets of his hoodie. Across the grass, a group of kids played soccer, their laughter carrying through the cool afternoon air. Johnny sipped his coffee, pretending not to notice how Martin's gaze lingered on them. "You ever play?" he asked casually. Martin shrugged. "A little. When I was younger." Johnny raised a brow. "You're still young." Martin huffed. "Not that young." Johnny smirked but didn't push. Instead, he leaned back, stretching his legs out in front of him, watching as the game continued. The sun was warm, the wind soft, and for the first time in weeks, there was no rush, no looming deadlines, no crisis to handle. Just this. Martin shifted beside him, Then, after a long pause, he murmured, "This is nice." Johnny nodded. "Yeah." They sat there in comfortable silence, just watching the world move around them. Johnny hadn't expected things to change so much. At first, he thought Martin would stay for a few days, maybe a week. He thought Amanda would take her son and move on, back to whatever life they had before Kenneth Ward had shattered it. But that hadn't happened. Instead, Amanda had made herself at home, cleaning, cooking, and making sure Martin ate real meals instead of whatever scraps he used to live on. She never asked for anything, never overstepped, but her presence settled into the house in a way that felt natural. And Martin had changed too. He still had his walls, but they weren't as high. He still hesitated sometimes, and still had moments where he seemed to expect everything to fall apart. But then, there were moments like this morning, when Johnny walked into the kitchen and found him flipping pancakes, Amanda stirring coffee beside him. Martin had looked up, a spatula in one hand, and muttered, "You like 'em burnt or not burnt?" Johnny had smirked. "Not burnt, preferably." Martin had huffed. Yeah, no promises." It was small, ordinary. But to Johnny, it was everything. He had spent years in this house alone, convincing himself that was how he preferred it. But now, with Amanda bustling in the kitchen and Martin arguing about whether syrup was necessary for pancakes, Johnny realized something. They weren't just guests anymore. They belonged here. And for the first time in his life, Johnny Butler wasn't alone. The days blended into a new kind of normal. One Johnny hadn't expected, but found himself easing into. Martin was no longer just a guest in his house, and Amanda wasn't just someone keeping the place clean. There was an unspoken rhythm between them now, an ease that had never existed before. It was in the way Martin didn't hesitate before raiding the fridge, in the way Amanda scolded him about leaving his shoes in the hallway, like a mother who had been doing it all his life. Johnny didn't stop them. He let the house become something it had never been, a home. A small victory. One evening, Johnny found Martin sitting at the dining table, a mess of papers spread out before him. He frowned. "You trying to solve a murder or just making a mess?" Martin didn't look up. "Your expense reports were a disaster, so I started going through them." Johnny blinked. "I have an accountant for that." Martin snorted. "Yeah? You might want a new one." He tapped a section with his pen. "You're paying for materials you don't need, and whoever's handling your payroll didn't factor in tax adjustments for your last 3 hires. That's going to be a nightmare when tax season hits." Johnny stepped closer, scanning the papers. He knew enough to spot when something was wrong, and Martin wasn't just making guesses. He was right. Johnny whistled low. "Damn." Martin leaned back, stretching his arms behind his head. "So? Do I get a raise?" Johnny smirked. "You're not even on payroll, kid." Martin huffed. "Figures." Johnny eyed him. "You like this stuff, don't you?" Martin shrugged, but there was a flicker of something in his expression, something that almost looked like pride. "I don't know, just makes sense, I guess." Johnny tapped the papers. "Keep this up, and I might actually have to start paying you." Martin rolled his eyes, but he didn't hide the small smile pulling at his lips. A simple day one afternoon, Johnny suggested they take a walk. Not to a fancy restaurant or an event, just a walk. Martin had been skeptical at first, but he didn't argue. They ended up at the park, the same one they had visited before. The air was crisp, the smell of grass and warm earth drifting around them. The sounds of laughter and the occasional bark of a dog filled the space. Martin walked a few steps ahead, kicking at a loose pebble. He seemed lighter somehow, the sharp edges of the boy Johnny had first met softening with time. They sat on the same bench as before, watching the world move around them. Johnny glanced at Martin. "You still think you're too old to play soccer?" Martin smirked. "Not my thing," Johnny hummed. "So what is your thing?" Martin shrugged. "Still figuring that out?" Johnny nodded. "That's all right. You've got time." Martin was quiet for a moment, then murmured, Did you always know what you wanted to do? Johnny thought about it. Not really. I knew I didn't want to be broke. That was about it. Martin huffed a laugh. Solid plan. Johnny smirked. Worked out all right. They sat in silence after that, the sky shifting from afternoon gold to a dusky shade of orange. As the sun dipped lower, Johnny leaned forward, resting his arms on his knees. "Martin," he said, his tone unusually serious. The boy looked up, sensing the shift. Johnny exhaled slowly. "You know you don't have to stay here forever, right?" Martin tensed slightly. "Yeah, I know." Johnny nodded. "But if you want to—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You'll always have a home here." Martin stared at him, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, finally, he gave a small nod. "Okay," he said, voice quiet but steady. Johnny didn't press. He didn't need to. Because some things didn't have to be said out loud to be understood. Martin wasn't his son, but he was family. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. And if you enjoyed this story, please share it with your friends on WhatsApp. And now, share your feelings with us and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values, yet entertaining.